So I'm going to kick us off. So thank you everyone who's sort of joining us. We've got about 6 seconds until we technically stop off at 11:05, but lots of people are here. I have the privilege of introducing Natalia Bailey, whose last name is one of my favorite things because I love putting Baileys in my coffee. Natalia is a policy advisor with the Digital Finance Department at the IIF, with a large focus on transformation of the financial systems, which is really interesting for me personally because I've worked in financial services for over 20 years, and I've been hearing the word transformation and how we're going to use data and analytics and machine learning to increase user experience and workflow and regulation for years. So I'm really curious to see where Natalia is really taking those aspirations and turning them into reality. She's got a large focus on the application of new technologies, such as machine learning, as we said, in the domain of risk, compliance, and financial sector supervision. And she's conducted a series of deep dive assessments to address common challenges, including things like explainability and interpretability, as well as biases and ethical implications, which is also fascinating. We all know that machine learning is only as good as the coders. And so, you know, the biases and the inherent biases that get brought into the code we build is a very interesting topic in today's world of regulation and machine learning. Prior to the IIF, she focused on working in banking prudential regulation, in particular risk sensitivity of the regulatory capital framework, RWA, and credit risk. She's got a master's of public policy from George Mason University and a bachelor's from the economics from the Hollins University, where she attended as a recipient of the IIE Fulbright Scholarship. Suffice to say, you've got an incredibly intelligent individual that's going to be speaking with today about topics that really do hit home on both of us as customers, consumers, and users. How banks and financial institutions are leveraging machine learning is something I talk to my clients with on daily. So I'm really, really interested in what we're going to learn from Natalia today. So for all those on the chat, if you do have any questions, please post them there. We will capture them the best we can. But without further ado, over to you, Natalia. Thank you so much. Excited to hear what you have to say today.
Thank you, Stuart. And I'm sorry for everyone that was listening my conversation about vaccines, but that was a really gracious and very nice introduction. So I'll go ahead and share my screen with you. So I won't introduce myself again because that's being done. But what I'll do quickly is to sort of walk you through what we've been doing at the IIF. So for those that are not familiar, the IIF is we have over 450 members over 70 countries. We are the Association for Financial Institutions. And since late 2017, we've been looking at how our member institutions are using machine learning. And we've done that through a series of surveys. So we've looked at it, how they're applying it within credit risk and in anti-money laundering and financial crime prevention. And we've also done some of those deep dives or research papers on some of those key areas that came through in discussions with supervisors and regulators. And that's been on explainability and interpretability, and also on bias and ethical implications of machine learning models. On that last one, that is something that we are having a strong focus on this year as well. So there'll be more coming on that area from us. But within that scope, our studies have looked at a wide array of case studies, and we've discussed the challenges and opportunities. And most recently, we conducted this survey that provided an overview of the end-to-end model governance process for machine learning models. And what you're seeing there, and in today's presentation, I'll be using data points from the last survey results. We conducted this survey in the first quarter and second quarter of last year, and the results were published in December of last year. The map you're seeing shows you the diversity of our sample. We had 66 firms that participated, and these diverse, when I talk about diversity, we're not only talking about geographically, but also in terms of business models and geographies. A couple of things before I go into the study. So the reason we did this study is that one of the things that had come through in discussions with regulators and with supervisors was the importance of machine learning systems following the same strict requirements that are placed in any other type of model. So that includes robust model development, implementation, and use, sound model validation process that is ensuring the models are behaving the way they're supposed to, an effective framework on governance. So our study looks at the end-to-end model governance process. So it's looking at the inputs, the data, as a governance mechanism, model validation, model implementation, and model monitoring of machine learning models. And the scope is different than previous surveys that we've done. So we haven't focused specifically on credit risk like we've done in the past or in anti-money laundering and financial crime prevention. Rather, we casted a wider net, meaning that firms could talk about their use in any area. But some of the use cases that we've seen in this study are in areas such as credit risk, compliance, market risk assessment, insurance underwriting, and also in more customer-facing areas like marketing, for instance, and customer service. Another thing that is important to keep in mind is that 68% of our sample is using machine learning in production, and 26% of our sample has active pilot projects in place, meaning that they have pilot projects that they think are going to be deployed into production within the next 6 to 12 months. And this was at the time that they were surveyed last year. Finally, before I go into the details, the full report, so the geographical, and I mean, there are many, many different aspects that we discussed on the full analysis, that's only available to the participating firms. So if your firm is one of them, please let me know and I'm happy to email you the report, and also to the official sector. However, there is a public version of this report that is available for download on our website. And a lot of the data points that you'll see today are on that public version. So let's get into it. I'm only going to give you 9 data points today. Hopefully I'll be able to do it within the time that I have. But there is no one-size-fits-all approach to machine learning governance. There are very interesting regional differences. You don't see them in this chart, unfortunately, but believe me, they are. But what we are seeing is that some of these differences are attributed to existing non-discrimination and data protection laws. You see that 36% of the firms are using machine learning, their existing model risk management framework for machine learning models. That means that their framework covers all types of model for the model life cycle purpose, and that includes machine learning models. Firms would say things like machine learning is just one more type of model. It works within our framework. However, there are several firms that are moving towards an enhancement of their existing framework. That is, they're leveraging their existing framework and they're adding some specific machine learning considerations to it. And at the time that we sample firms, 15% had developed an enhancement to that framework, and 29% were developing an enhancement. And when I talk about, I've been asked before, what types of enhancements are they doing? And typically what we're seeing is they are expanding the independent model risk, model validation in terms of skill sets and capabilities so they can capture machine learning applications. And those that have enhanced their framework already, they discuss adding principles for data use. They enhance those, they discuss adding these expansions to validation methods and monitoring systems that capture machine learning specifications. The topic of bias and ethical implications comes through a lot when we talk about enhancements as well. And just to give you an idea, you don't see these in this graph, but at the regional level, we found that European and American firms were using their existing model risk management framework at a noticeably higher rate than in other parts of the world. And most Canadian firms, since we're talking in this festival in Toronto, most Canadian firms in the sample, 80% of them are currently developing an enhancement to their framework. So they are that part of firms that are looking at the model lifecycle, and they're trying to identify where are those unique risks that are specific to machine learning, and then they're adding some adjustments or making some adjustments. In this chart, I don't find surprising, but and I'll mention why in a minute. But only half of the sample has a clear definition of what constitutes a machine learning model and can be included for consideration in the governance process. So if I think about when we have these discussions with different firms, there is no consensus globally or industry-wide about machine learning definitions. So this is not surprising. In terms of what are the key drivers for when something is considered for the governance process, materiality was one of the key drivers. And materiality is typically assessed across multiple dimensions. Some of the things that they may consider are financial impact, the use case objectives, the impacted party, stakeholders, and the complexity of the methodology. And this is another area where I wish I could share with you the regional graph, but I'll just sort of walk you through it. But there are very large differences per region. So the US, Asia Pacific, China, and other Europe, I forgot to mention earlier. So we have a differentiation between Euro area and other Europe would be firms are outside the Euro area, but are in Europe. And other Europe, they have defined their machine learning models for governance at a higher rate. In Canada, firms favor performing a risk assessment that is based on materiality to determine the depth and the scope of risk and control activities that are required. And then something else that we also found interesting is that most US firms in our sample, they don't use materiality as a key driver. The key driver for most US firms has been methodology. So that includes the techniques that were used, the characteristics of the model, the volume of data that was used, the degree of transparency, and in some cases, out of sample prediction. In terms of the controls against unfair bias outcomes, so overall, firms rely on several control processes to mitigate against unfair bias and discrimination of machine learning models. I mean, as we know, unfair bias can come from many different entry points, and they need to be addressed throughout the different stages of the governance process. So the controls that have been chosen are very much linked to the use case. And you're seeing that most firms, 71%, rely on the audit function as part of the overall review of the effectiveness of the governance framework. So what we are seeing is that through the internal audit function, firms have been assessing the design and engagement of controls that govern these machine learning use cases and the development and implementation of machine learning models. Many firms have also updated guidance, again, relating to bias and fairness, or they have formed machine learning model validation frameworks. So this is part of those enhancements that we had discussed. And this is something that we at the IF have been focusing on and will continue to focus on, but identifying where and how bias is present, reviewing key assumptions and limitations, assessing model applicability, are all many different approaches that firms are taking within these controls. And again, since this is for Canadian audience mainly, there was one Canadian firm that mentioned that they have been focusing on an end-to-end AI governance audit. So they're looking at processes from the creation of the use case through implementation, including controls are in place to mitigate against machine learning models producing unfair bias or discriminatory outcomes. The other thing that I find interesting is if you look at that 50% that has developed a code of ethics that is defined at the institution level. So that's something else that we've been seeing that more and more firms are doing. And again, keeping in mind that only 68% of the sample is using machine learning models in production. So several of the firms that have established some controls, and you'll see through the different slides, may not have machine learning models in production yet. However, they're laying down the groundwork because they are planning on deploying them. And the third most chosen one was sensitive attributes excluded from the beginning and not including as part of the feature analysis, selection, and engineering process. And I mentioned this one because this was one of the controls that was chosen the most in Canada. So this was 80% for Canadian firms, which was one of the highest overall, but it was also one of the highest that was chosen for Canada. Something else that we looked at was governance centralization. And what we are seeing is that governance centralization or hybrid, which I'll explain in a minute, is more common in firms that are using machine learning more prominently, or they're planning on using machine learning in multiple areas. So, and when we talk to them about these, what they say is that they're doing that for consistency and completeness. You're seeing that 43% of our overall sample has the governance of machine learning models centralized to that one single body within the institution. And you're seeing that 33% leave that as the responsibility for the individual businesses. And those hybrid approaches that you're seeing at 24%, what we call it hybrid because there isn't a complete centralization. In many cases, there's sort of like a pyramid structure in place. But to give you an example, there was one Canadian firm that has a single committee of analytics and data office, but not all the analytic teams who build teams sit in that committee. So what ends up happening is that there are models that are governed by the single committee policy, but then there are others that are at the individual model portfolio level. And then in other cases, and this is more widely not within Canadian firms, there may be aspects of the model that relate to other risk types. So there may be compliance or reputational risk or legal or privacy, and those are overseen by those respective control partners. So we also looked at what steps were taken to establish roles and responsibilities for those that are responsible for the governance of machine learning models. And that's a very long-winded question. But rather than viewing this chart as steps, I see this chart as what strategies have been prioritized by firms to define roles and responsibilities for the governance of machine learning models. So you're seeing that most firms, 60%, are embedding individuals with machine learning expertise within the model risk management framework. And that is followed by training relevant employees and clearly defining highly specialized skill roles for machine learning. And this ties in very well with responses that we had from our previous surveys, where we were looking at the challenges that arose from the use of machine learning, credit risk, and anti-money laundering, and also in some of the different pieces that the IS has been doing that looks at digitalization. And what we're seeing is that hiring, and you've probably heard about this before, but hiring and retaining talent remains an issue for the sector. Financial institutions are competing to build multidisciplinary teams formed by AI, ML experts, but also with business domain experts. So it remains difficult to find talent that can leverage data science to obtain business insights and address a business problem. And I mean, if you've heard me speak before, you've probably heard me say that there was one executive that mentioned that finding someone that has all of these skills is like finding a unicorn. That's how difficult some of the executives mentioned that this is. Retaining has become more of an issue than hiring. But more widely, in some of the discussions that we had while we were writing this report, what we're seeing is that roles and responsibilities of the CRO and the Chief Data Officer are also evolving, and they're intersecting in many cases. So the role of the risk function and the role of the data office has changed a lot within the last decade. And the CROs, in many instances, are being given additional risk function obligations and responsibilities that have to do with enabling digital transformation. So in terms of model validation, and I think this is extremely important, assessing machine learning model robustness is perhaps one of the most important things that we're seeing in this survey. But each model validation technique used to assess machine learning model robustness, they all have their limitations. And how useful they are depends on the business application, the team that is using it, and the complexity of the model. So in some cases, firms validate machine learning applications before and after deployment. And they may use various different techniques. This was a multiple choice option, so firms could choose more than one. But the most common method that was chosen was in-sample and out-of-sample testing at 91%. And that was followed closely by data quality validation at 80%, and you're seeing at 79% outcome monitoring against the benchmark. And this is also anecdotally, but many executives remark that this COVID-19 pandemic initially caused a sudden decrease in the model performance of machine learning models. So the pandemic created this situation that could not be forecasted based on historical data. But something else that the pandemic, well, among the other horrible things that it's done, but something that it has also done is that it has highlighted the importance of model validation, model testing, and model performance monitoring. So some executives mentioned that the decrease on the model performance was minimized by a strong focus on ongoing model performance monitoring. That is, ensuring that there isn't any model performance drift. Canada actually selected data quality validation at 100%. And data quality validation, interestingly, is something that has come through as a rising challenge. When I look at results from our previous reports, if I compare data points from 2018 to 2019, specifically for credit risk, there was a 178% increase in the number of firms that single out silo data as hindering their ability to leverage machine learning fully. And this was something that was particularly challenging for multinational financial institutions that have legacy IT systems, where those legacy systems presented a challenge for leveraging data and building analytics on top of that data. On model implementation, on updating model parameters based on refreshed data, so models may be reviewed on a more frequent basis, and it depends on the complexity and the materiality of the model, which can result in identification of limitations or overlays wherever that's appropriate. 47% of the sample has an implementation platform that caters for the need to frequently update model parameters based on refreshed data collected. And then you have 39% that are defining those model change mechanisms. So of course, how often it gets updated is situational, its implementation is specific. And some models may be designed to be updated more often, more frequent basis, and it depends on that use case. In terms of model monitoring and the feedback mechanisms and controls, 73% of our sample has feedback mechanisms in place that are ensuring that outcomes are as expected and for preventing input data and features from drifting over time. You're seeing there, I wrote that European, American, and Canadian firms, they have these mechanisms in place at a significantly higher rate than China, Japan, Asia Pacific, and Middle East and Africa. So Canadian firms have a very similar framework than the US, and to some extent, some of the European countries. And in both, particularly Canada and the US, performance monitoring accounts for feedback mechanisms and controls. So the purpose of model monitoring, the assessment of the monitoring results, the actions that are taken to address any model issues that are required in the model monitoring plan that is designed to capture all these nuances of the model, including machine learning models. What is different between non-machine learning models and machine learning models based on responses that we receive is that firms are placing a stronger emphasis on input data quality and distribution. And this is the last slide I have with information before I can go into questions. But firms use a variety of safeguards to mitigate against the risk of machine learning models. And the choice of the safeguard, again, is very much dependent on the individual model in question. So there are areas such as marketing or customer service that are less complex and impactful than credit risk, whether you're granted a loan or not, or fraud detection. The most common safeguards are performance monitoring at 78% and monitoring model accuracy based on thresholds at 66%. Performance monitoring was chosen by Canadian firms at 100%, and many firms indicated that once a model is in production, the framework captures the use of safeguards as part of the model monitoring framework, which we discussed in the previous slides. Many firms remarked that it is crucial to do performance monitoring, as models will degrade over time as you use them. So, model drift, the degradation of models' predictive power. And there are several metrics to monitor machine learning model performance. And the choice of the metrics are based on factors such as the type of task, whether it's regression versus classification, the business objective, and the distribution of the target variable, for instance. And model monitoring frameworks in many cases are consistent between machine learning and non-machine learning models. So they're consistent between the different use cases, regardless of whether it's machine learning or non-machine learning models. Model accuracy based on thresholds is a metric that is really within performance monitoring for many firms. It's commonly done as part of backtesting, but it is also done along the model lifecycle purpose in the case of adaptive models. And there was one Canadian executive that put it as each model has its own specific model monitoring function with defined thresholds. And if the threshold is breached, it potentially causes an examination of the model, which leads to fine-tuning and redevelopment. Another thing that came through was human-in-the-loop mechanisms at 57%. The firms that selected these, they also mentioned how critically important it was for the development of their machine learning models. So overall, the metric and the safeguard chosen depends very much on the use case and the context it is being applied to. So I think the most important thing here is that the adoption of machine learning continues to increase. And we were having, those that were on when I was having the conversations about the weather and vaccines, it is something that we are seeing our firms, in our member firms, using more and more. In conversations, it's no longer whether they are going to be using machine learning, but more of a strategic decision of how and how they're going to be using it. And also considerations such as bias and ethical implications are becoming increasingly more important for firms. And in our conversations with regulators and supervisors, one of the things that have come forward quite a lot is that whether it is machine learning or not machine learning, it's really not as important as whether they're following these strict requirements that relate to the robustness of model development and implementation, of having sound model validation, and having an effective framework. The other point that I think is really important here is materiality. What is considered in the governance process, and materiality being that key driver for many firms. So I'll stop there and see if there's any questions.
Thank you so much, Natalia. That was really, really interesting. So there are a couple questions. I'll start with a very tactical one. There is a couple of questions about access to some of the research that you presented. We've already shared your website link, but outside of that, is there other places they can go to access this research if it's not posted on your website?
It is posted on the website.
Okay.
I'll be happy to also drop the info on the chat if that's helpful to people.
Sure.
But it is all available on the IOF website. So the papers that we've done on explainability, interpretability, bias and ethics, and also we did a piece on recommendations to policymakers. And the summary versions of all of our reports, those that we've done in credit risk or in anti-money laundering, as well as this one, are all available on the website. They just don't show regional breakdowns, and they don't really go into specific use cases. But if you're in a firm that shows on the map, you can have access to the full report.
Wonderful. Okay, thank you. Some more ML related questions. Where can we read more about how existing frameworks can be enhanced in terms of validation and bias methods?
You can read it in the report.
Yeah.
I don't think there's been many things that have been written in terms of what enhancements are being done. But what it seems like is that strengthening the model validation framework is one of the things that firms are doing. And the internal audit function that I mentioned is something else that firms are focusing on. And I think if you've been reading through the news, having principles in place is like governing principles that are more high-level principles on fairness and accountability. So a lot of firms are moving in that direction, sort of following what the Monetary Authority of Singapore has done with the SEED principles. And they are looking at use cases internally within their firm and trying to deploy those and see how they will work internally. So many of those have come forward and put something publicly about those principles. That is something else IAF is working on with a group of firms, looking at that data ethical charter that looks into machine learning, but it also looks at it's wider than machine learning, although it becomes more important when it's being used for machine learning models.
Okay. We probably only have time for one last question, but it's one I really like. The learning part of machine learning is notoriously opaque. How do practitioners of machine learning and governance deal with this, especially when communicating with non-technical stakeholders?
That is a really good question.
I thought it was too. And if you have an answer to this, you should be making tons of millions of dollars. But anyway, please, your answer.
Yeah, so it is notoriously opaque, and I think some of the firms have been dealing with these with post hoc explainability. Although we are seeing we're seeing an increase on firms that are trying to design and build models that are explainable from the very beginning. And that is something that we are going to be working more with firms this year, just to try to understand how they're doing that. But that's something that is increasingly being done. So when we first started looking at these a couple of, 3 years or so, 4 years now ago, firms were more working on using explainability techniques. They may be using like surrogate type of models or challenger models, which was what they were doing back then. But now I think that they are trying to look at how they can build these models that are explainable, interpretable from the very beginning. It is $1 million question. I think if when it becomes that these interpretable, explainable models are more status quo, then more and more firms will be able to enter into the space. But it is an area, as you know, that is changing every day.
Yep. No, definitely. Listen, thank you so much for your time. For those questions we didn't get to, I'm sure Natalia will be welcome for you to reach out on LinkedIn, etc. Thank you so much. Really, really interesting. And thank you for your continued investment in this area. I do think the governance and many of the biases and many things we've spoken about today are going to continue to be challenges. And we as both business and technology practitioners need to sort of come together and figure out how to sort of solve them unified. So looking forward to more conversations with you in the future, Natalia. I have looked you up on LinkedIn, and we will see you in the financial community around bringing governance to all of this wonderful opportunity. So thank you so much, Natalia. Everyone on the call, we'll see you in the general room, and Natalia will see you throughout the day. Thank you so much.
Thank you.